So I think we'll get started, and the only reason for any formality at all is that we're recording this, and because it is, in addition to a lively and engaging talk, you're about to experience also a chance for the school to express what a significant moment this is for us each year when the Emet lecture comes around. And as the Dean of the Law School, I want to welcome those who aren't normally part of the ebb and flow of life here. And this is one of the real strengths of bringing the Emet together with the Nathanson Center, is that it brings that element of interdisciplinarity to it. The Emet is got an odd trajectory in this sense. It takes its name, as some of you will know, from the Hebrew meaning light of truth, and that seems entirely appropriate for a lecture series, but gained its origins actually out of some contested litigation, an unhappy origin by any stretch, but it led to seed money and a bit of a dispute about what to do with it. And the decision was that it should go to fund this series at Osgoode. And even before coming together with the Nathanson Center, it had featured people like Martha Minow, Derek Bell, Duncan Kennedy, John Finnis, John Gardner. List is a long and illustrious one. And it's been a consistent point of reference for many around Osgoode's commitment to both exposing our community to the very best of scholarship and to contributing to it in a collaborative and again interactive way. The Jack and May Nathanson Center on Transnational Human Rights, Crime and Security is, of course, now a lively home for this series, and its themes have come to infuse some new life and sharper focus in the Emet as well. So we are getting, I think, today a fusion of topics and perspectives in this lecture that brings together themes that we've been discussing in different fora here for many years, and we had a chance over lunch just to talk about some current events and how many themes in Chris's work are picked up on in things that we are taking from the headlines every day here. So it's a pleasure to welcome him, but I'll let Francois Tanguay-Renaud do the formal introduction of the speaker. So it just is left for me to say again that we want to welcome you here to the Osgoode community. Welcome again the friends from philosophy, and I know some have traveled from as far away as Hamilton to be here, not to mention Glendon and points further afield, and it's going to be a treat. I'm looking forward to it. And with that, let me turn it over to Francois.
Mr. Dean, colleagues, distinguished guests, graduate students, and JD students, on behalf of the Jack and May Nathanson Center on Transnational Human Rights, Crime and Security, and the Ontario Legal Philosophy Partnership, I have the pleasure of welcoming to Osgoode today Professor Christopher Kutz, who is a professor of law at Boalt Hall Law School at the University of California at Berkeley. Professor Kutz joined the Jurisprudence and Social Policy program in 1998 at Berkeley, and in 2006 he assumed the directorship of the Kadish Center for Morality, Law, and Public Affairs. Professor Kutz clerked for Judge Stephen F. Williams of the U.S. Court of Appeals of the District of Columbia, and was a visiting professor at Columbia and Stanford law schools. His work focuses on moral, political, and legal philosophy, and he has a particular interest in the foundations of criminal law, international law, and constitutional law. Now, I first encountered Professor Kutz's work at a conference that was held in Oxford in June 2005 on the topic of complicity while I was still a graduate student in Oxford. And there he engaged in a spirited exchange with my former supervisor at the time, John Gardner, who was, as the dean pointed out, himself a former Emet lecturer. And the debate was on the nature of complicity in morality and law. Now, for me, that was one of those moments of reckoning, right? The moment where one, and I think any graduate student encounters that moment at some point, and probably better if it happens sooner than later, but the moment where one has to come to terms with the fact that, yes, one's supervisor may actually not have worked it all out. As always, Professor Kutz's argument was sharp, eloquently presented, in fact, devastating, and at the same time always presented with the same care and cordial way. Now, to be sure, after much thought, and I suppose that's the nature of the philosophical endeavor, well, I found myself disagreeing with both John and Chris. But I certainly learned a lot from Chris on that day. You know, I became a better philosopher, saying that I ought to be suspicious of my supervisor. Now, Chris certainly remains a master of the specific question that is complicity. His book, Complicity, Ethics and Law for a Collective Age, which was published in 2000 by Cambridge University Press, which is one of those very rare philosophical bestsellers, I must say, addresses the question of individual and moral legal responsibilities for harms that are brought about through collective and corporate activity. Professor Kutz has also published articles in leading journals that are too numerous to list, but including the Yale Law Journal, the California Law Review, Philosophy and Public Affairs, Legal Theory, and so forth. His current work centers on democratic theory, the law of war, the metaphysics of criminal law, and the nature of political legitimacy. His lecture today, entitled Democratic Holy Wars, is, I think, an extension of this work on the same theme. Now, in a day and age where democracy, perhaps alongside human rights, or sometimes itself framed as a human rights, that is democracy, tends to be portrayed as the West's answer to let's call it militarized jihad, as ultimate justification for international resort to arms. So think only of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. So given this, the topic is no doubt very timely. Is bringing about, or perhaps sustaining democracy always, or even ever, a good or a sufficient reason to go to war or to intervene militarily in another state's business? If so, what is so magical about this thing, about this institution, or as some would have it, this practice, this societal practice that is democracy? If not, then what is it that our political leaders don't understand about democracy, which leads them to think that, or at least to claim that, indeed, democracy is a good reason to go to war or to intervene militarily? The question is no doubt daunting, and we are fortunate to have with us today Professor Christopher Kutz, who hopefully will help us see through the fog of everyday life that we're encountering in our nation states. Now, the format of the seminar, Professor Kutz will speak for approximately 50 minutes to an hour, and this will be followed by a short Q&A session. Now, there is a seminar that will be held tomorrow from 2:30 to 4:30 in room 4034, in which we will discuss the lecture. So if you're planning to attend the seminar and you have deep and searching questions, we would ask you to remain, to keep them for tomorrow. And tomorrow, Louis-Philippe Hodgson from the Department of Philosophy here at York and myself will respond to Professor Kutz, and then he will, again, correct us and hopefully help me see the light once more, the light of truth, or Emet. So this is it for the format today. It's also the case that the the conference today, the lecture is going to be followed by a reception which will be held outside the moot court. So I thank you very much for being present here today. And without further ado, on Democratic Holy Wars, Professor Christopher Kutz.
So switch this on, and is this, that's off. Thank you very much, Dean Francois. Thank you for the invitation. I'm enormously honored and flattered to be here in the distinguished lineage of Emet lecturers. I'm thrilled by the introduction, although I must say I feel a little guilty about contributing to a parricide, the slaying of one's graduate advisor. But I'm happy to have provided some service in that way. It's a form of necessary violence and self-realization. I'm going to talk about other forms of violence and self-realization today. Violence of revolution to some extent, but mainly the violence of intervention. And as Francois said, this is a paper that comes out of a broader work, a book I'm completing now on democracy and war, a book which takes as its prompt the idea that our principles of war, our jus ad bellum, our principles for the justification of going to war, and our principles of conduct in war, our jus in bello, predate democratic thinking. The jus ad bellum emerges from a tradition of sovereign states and strong conceptions of sovereignty, of raison d'etat, of real politics as justifying war. Our jus in bello descends variously from a chivalric tradition, a conception of virtue, and from, I think, a more general, at least in the 19th century, a more general utilitarianism, which sees the saving of lives as of paramount value. We've moved in some ways beyond both those traditions, both in our practical politics, but also in our philosophical aspirations. We've moved towards what, to my mind, is a perhaps pernicious focus on democracy as the sole legitimating value. And the book from which this paper is drawn is an attempt to look at what happens if we take democracy seriously, what happens for better or for worse to our thinking about the doctrines of the jus ad bellum and the jus in bello. There's a particular thing that I'm concerned about, and this paper touches on it, which is that the just war theory was dogged for a long time by an over-moralization, the idea that war was a form of justified punishment for wrongdoing. And brutal as the centuries of war have been, the move from that moralized view of war, a view which can legitimate virtually anything done in war, to a non-moral, an amoral conception, what is sometimes called a conception of regular war, I think had some limiting influence. I worry now, with the focus on democracy, that we're moving back into a moralized theory of war. And that is the hint for the title of my paper, Democratic Holy Wars. I can't remember if I added a question mark or not to the title, but there's meant to be a question mark, and I'll leave it to you to decide how to answer that question. It is a principle universally acknowledged that an international system in want of a structure of mutual respect and forbearance is a system on the edge of anarchy. It is a further commonplace that the tradition of Westphalian sovereignty is buried beneath the legacy of Cold War politics in an increasingly potent international human rights politics. A doctrine of legitimacy in international affairs that before rested mainly on territorial control now reflects a messy normative calculus of comity, individual rights, and balance of power politics, a calculus that provides few assurances in practice and none in theory. The absence of a coherent theory of interstate respect and forbearance has provided opportunities for mischief, both political and intellectual. Neoconservatives, sometimes joined by liberal scholars, have treated the absence of domestic democratic institutions as an argument for military and political intervention. While pro-democratic, humanitarian interventions are hardly the norm in international affairs, the gathering momentum behind the movement, spurred by the grotesque failure of the developed world to act in Rwanda in 1994, should give us pause, lest the emerging doctrine become not a force for humanity, but a broad license for war. This is the risk of democratic holy wars, that the presumption of non-interference be replaced by a presumption of righteous violence. If the context is political, the problem is also conceptual. Without a post-Westphalian theory of state personality, our conceptual resources are too limited to describe the normative contours of our political collectives, too weak to provide the bulwark against the routinization of international adventures, well or ill meant. Democracy is, I think, too strong a concept, too limited in its justified application, too legitimating in its aspirations. Responding to the collapse of traditional conceptions of sovereignty, John Rawls and Michael Walzer, both following John Stuart Mill, have tried to resurrect the concept of a people, linked by culture and history, if not by institutions, as the bearer of rights of forbearance and self-defense. But respect for a shared culture is too weak, given the hybrid and competing cultures and identities of virtually every polity. Most polities, indeed, are caught in the middle, undemocratic and culturally plural. As such, they lack a principled presumption against international intervention. They're instead protected only by the contingent calculus of interests. Even taking for granted the rights and duties of international society to intervene in cases of genocidal massacre, the middle ground is one that needs to be made more secure, conceptually and politically. This is the middle ground of, for lack of a better term, what one might call run-of-the-mill authoritarian violence. Not enough or ethno-nationally targeted enough to trigger the Genocide Convention, but enough to stir international outrage. It is the middle ground now of Syria, Bahrain, and Libya, and it has been the ground of much of Latin America. In this lecture, I try to fill the middle ground with an account of the moral standing of political communities that lack both full democratic pedigrees and common sympathies. An account that entails both qualified rights of self-defense and qualified duties of other states to forbear from intervention. By looking to the moral core of what I call active political community, a core that can, but need not, be realized through democratic procedures, we can recover some of the moral ground of sovereignty without retreating to Westphalian statism. The salient characteristic of a defensible community, I argue, is the way in which its collective activity is manifest, an agency that depends upon, but is not constituted by, the ties of identity, culture, and sympathy. This activity, which can broadly and vaguely be called politics, has a distinctive intrinsic value, and it is indeed this value that forms the core of what we admire in democratic states. But it is in the nature of the value of collective political agency that it is best respected by being admired from afar rather than managed directly. It is at the base of the hard doctrine of non-intervention urged by Mill and latterly by Michael Walzer, a doctrine that requires standing back as people stumble and fall rather than following the instincts of the cosmopolitan heart and rushing in with aid. Now, few people today directly advocate an armed intervention simply to promote democracy, though such arguments were famously made by the Bush administration about Iraq and the Clinton administration about Haiti. Rather, the argument for democracy promotion tends to ride in the saddle of the better established principle of massacre prevention, a principle institutionalized now as the responsibility to protect, or R2P. The R2P doctrine, as embedded in Security Council Resolution 1674, permits armed interventions in cases of genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. The basis is simple. A state that fails to protect its citizens can make no claim to external legitimacy, specifically no claim to a monopoly on the right to govern and control its subjects. It is hence open to other states to provide the missing protection through their intervention. The R2P policy limits itself to crimes of extreme state violence, but the logic is not so limited. If a state is depriving its citizens of other forms of basic justice, then it lacks standing and political morality to object to intervention. Access to democratic institutions is a demand of basic justice. A state, therefore, depriving its citizens of that access has no standing to object to an intervention by others to provide them. Moreover, other states, to the extent they recognize a global duty to create the conditions of justice, find themselves with a duty to intervene when it seems they can do more harm than good. This, anyway, is the logic of the position, the temptation for democracies to fight holy wars, as my perhaps overheated title puts it. The argument from and for democracy is so potent because democracy incorporates such a rich range of values, including values of self-realization, collective deliberation, and the construction of institutions of social justice. As a result, its prescription for action, its global writ, is correspondingly broad, limited only by the values internal to democracy itself. If abiding in a democratic polity represents the greatest hope for a humanity intent on living autonomously and in conditions of justice, then democracy is what people deserve everywhere, and it should be brought to them unless there are positive reasons to abjure. Pragmatic arguments about blowback and unintended consequences reflect constraints on the view. But the general form of the argument to limit intervention must come from an interpretation of democracy itself. For if democracy represents the highest form of politics, its value will trump any considerations not themselves resting on democratic footings. The basic philosophical inquiry is the first step of my talk today. The next is going to be a translation into policy, and I can only offer a hint of that translation. In particular, I want to examine two policy questions at the border of the conceptual discussion. First, under what conditions, short of imminent and preventable massive loss of life, crimes against humanity or genocide, can forcible intervention be justified? Second, short of armed intervention, what other forms of external interference in political development are permissible? I will argue that, in fact, accepting the demand that democracies stand and fall on their own entails sharp limits even to the kind of non-forcible aid that can be provided to struggling democracies, a limit of transparent, non-coercive aid. I fully recognize that such a limit effectively rewards those authoritarian regimes most successful in tamping down democratic movements, but I see no defensible alternative. Let us start the inquiry by looking back to Libya. NATO and much of the West and the Arab League struggled with these questions in initiating what, as of at least now, has been a successful intervention in Libya, though its long-term prospects remain unknowable and its repercussions are clearly haunting international cooperation in the current civil conflict in Syria. The intervention was immediately justified in terms of Gaddafi's threat to hunt down and exterminate, in their closets, he said, all of his opponents. But within days it became, at the behest of France and the United States, a quest to rid Libya of Gaddafi, period, and to try to keep alight the spirit of the Arab Spring, the spirit of democratic protest. As a first genuine instance of UN-sanctioned intervention grounded in the R2P principle, Libya should have been limited to massacre prevention. But once the materiel was in place and the sorties were being flown, once the possible Security Council vetoes had been overcome in favor of the abstentions of Russia and China, there was no natural limit to the mission, only potential differences in tactics, a combination of bombings and diplomacy to remove Gaddafi, plus further interventions to install civil democracy. Indeed, the more poorly organized the rebel force of Libya came to appear, the greater the necessary role for intervening parties. The legitimacy of all this, of course, was predicated on the democratic aims and character of the interveners, satisfying the new, highly moralized jus ad bellum of democracy, such that war is justified when fought for democratic aims by democratic principalities. The worry, of course, is that this is not a stable recipe for a system of peace and international relations. It's a recipe for a system instead of superpowers and subaltern states, the latter always vulnerable to the judgments of the former, whether intervention should be pursued. Perhaps this is more or less the world we live in which some powers exercise a benign surveillance over others. But it falls short of an ideal of public interstate life that is also appealing, one grounded in the analogy to the life of citizens that we expect, analogy to the life of citizens, of toleration for patterns of life that may not please even if they do not exceed more stringent norms. What we seek, in other words, for democracies and for the world is an ethics of democratic foreign policy that limits the temptation to war, that finds intrinsic limits to the value of promoting democratic value. Before I move to the conceptual issues, let me name and respond what I imagine is the response many of you have already formed. It's just a matter of costs and benefits. On the one hand, we know from painful experience that armed interventions frequently make things worse for the state targeted for intervention by releasing civil and ethnic conflict with no authority to channel and manage that conflict. We know the further risk that interventions will create suspicions, frequently justified, in the targeted state of whatever group comes to power in its wake, entailing the perverse loss of legitimacy for the secular democratic states that interveners are most likely to want to support and bring into being. On the other hand, we know, or have some reason to think, that certain interventions can be helpful, though as I understand it, the jury is still out on many of them. Kosovo is probably the closest example to a consensus success story after a multi-year occupation. With enormous expenditures of time, money, and trust in imperfect local institutions, a reasonably stable and legitimate multi-ethnic state has emerged. What you might conclude from these truisms is that it is a matter of empirical guesswork, and that the right policy is simply a pragmatic and cautious one. With the R2P policy as a basic gatekeeper, democratic states should intervene or should deepen their interventions when and only when the intervention is likely to make things better. What we need, in other words, is not more philosophy, but better empirics, better ways to evaluate ex ante the success of these adventures. Let us call this the pragmatic view. Of course, the pragmatic view is consistent with a highly conservative conclusion that interventions are almost never likely to leave targeted states net better off, and that the knock-on effects of destabilizing international relations tip the balance yet further. But ultimately, it's all costs and benefits. Now, the empirical aspect of the question can't be avoided, and of course, in real politics, ad hoc and contextual decision-making will always be necessary. But the short response to the pragmatic view is that we are simply fooling ourselves if we think that our predictive powers are sufficient to generate reliable answers to these questions. There are far too many variables in play with too complicated power dynamics between internal parties and external state interests for the basic intervene or not decision to be rationally guided. The empirical fog is what calls out for the searchlight of principle, here as elsewhere. We can't avoid the philosophical inquiry. So I'm going to begin the philosophical inquiry with a somewhat silly example, as philosophers are prone to do. I imagine you Canadians gazing across your southern border and assessing the problems of the US healthcare system. You might conclude, reasonably enough, that an important dimension of justice would be better served if the US were to adopt a fully national and universal single-payer healthcare program. You also conclude, reasonably enough, that there is little political prospect of this change, and much reason to think that even the marginal improvements of recent years will be overturned by the election of a Republican president. The poor coverage of the US healthcare system has a serious human toll, estimated recently as at least 45,000 preventable deaths per year. That's deaths that would be avoided with universal healthcare. You Canadians, however, have determined that a relatively bloodless incursion into the US would cost no more than about 5,000 lives, mostly military, giving about a 9-to-1 ratio of lives saved to those lost. And thus the costs of the invasion would be reasonably proportional to the benefits, with those costs as necessary to the goal of bringing about basic justice. I'll candidly admit that something like this has stirred the fantasies of at least one American in my Canadiphilic moments. But I assume that in a more reflective moment, both Americans and Canadians would agree that whatever the proportionality calculus says, such an invasion would be impermissible, and that Americans would be entitled to defend against it, both soldiers and citizens in a levee en masse. Moreover, such a defense would be justified, I think, and international law agrees, even if it would result in many more than 45,000 lives being lost. Perhaps not everyone agrees. Some philosophers do believe that a so-called bloodless invasion of this sort would not justify self-defense. But such a position is, to say the least, radically counterintuitive. So the question is, what grounds the intuition that it's permissible for Americans to kill to defend their right to inadequate health care? An obvious answer is provided by democratic values. An American might well say that deplorable as our policy of radically unequal access to medical care is, it is all the same our policy, grounded in our democratic politics, and that policy choice deserves respect and non-interference because it is a product of a just decision-making process. Perhaps. But now let us complicate the example slightly. You look a little more closely at the United States, and you note that not only is our system of health care access deeply unjust, but that our institutions are far from democratic. You note the extraordinary role played by private money in US elections and interstitial politics, and the fact that campaign donations from those who profit from the private insurance-driven care system have an effective veto over more radical policy innovations. You might also note, a little more contentiously, that corporate-funded advertising vitiates the legitimating value of American public opinion as well. And so you conclude that not only does respect for democracy not stand in the way of invasion, but you can even accomplish two goals of justice: instituting comprehensive, transparent, publicly funded campaigning, as well as a single-payer health care system. What's not to like? I suspect, though, that most of you would nonetheless hesitate to declare the Canadian invasion permissible, or American self-defense impermissible. Even if justice could be furthered, democratic institutions enhanced at a modest cost in lives, the invasion would be wrong. Of course, there are all sorts of pragmatic reasons to think it would be wrong, even if we think it would be successful in these cases, not least the destabilizing effects of the invasion policy for the entire international system, providing excuses for less benevolently intended acts of war. The use by the Bush administration lawyers of the Kosovo precedent for non-UN sanctioned intervention to justify the Iraq War provides a cautionary tale. But such costs might be worth bearing. First, the precedent might not in fact increase the number of bad invasions, Arguably, such invasions will happen anyway, and it's only the window dressing that changes. Second, with more invasions, more justice might be realized around the world, and so the long-term effects might be net positive. Given, as I mentioned above, the hand-waving quality to arguments about practical effects, I think such calculations do not lie at the core of the concern. Something else does. Before I say what the concern properly is, I should address one other possibility, that we should distinguish between the permissibility of intervention and a right of self-defense. While we naturally think of the first as negating the second, that is, if you have a right to intervene, the intervened state does not have a right to defend, it could be the case that we are entitled to intervene even though the targeted state is entitled to resist. In the extreme R2P case, the answer is clearly no. A state that assaults its own people has no legitimate basis for self-defense. But in cases short of R2P, the cases of imperfect institutions, the question is more difficult. The old philosophical chestnut of the two men wrestling for a plank is another example of the right to struggle. The ethical permissibility of mutually assured destruction doctrine, which is an open question to be sure, but it's predicated as well on such rights, of both sides being permitted to attack and defend. The right of intervention might be, in some instances, something like a right to struggle or to compete for a share of limited resources. There's no logical inconsistency in the coexistence of the liberty rights of the two parties to vie for a single path to life. Even outside the context of existential threats, we might think that permissions to intervene and to defend are consistent. Take an analogy from individual life and imagine an individual suffering from a drug addiction, but not so impaired in other respects that he poses an immediate threat to himself or to others. Friends or family might plausibly claim justification in hiring a kidnapper to take him to a treatment center, even as the individual retains the right to struggle against the kidnapping, to leave the treatment center if opportunity arises. In effect, this reflects a conflict between different interests promoted by paternalism on the one hand, including the interests of those who love the addict, and the interests protected by concern for autonomy on the other hand. Both sets of interests are real, and neither is fully reducible to the other. Our interest in autonomy is not just a matter of belief that autonomous choice serves our other interests best. Balancing the two is a matter of understanding the addict as both a continuing person with a stake in his future, a future that will be better without the addiction, and as someone with a stake in his present. There's no general formula for how the interests will balance out against each other. But the point I wish to make here simply is that we can recognize simultaneously the argument for intervention and the argument for self-defense. Let us now return to the international plane in U.S.-Canadian relations, with the U.S. cast in the role of the addict. Now, states are not individuals, and there are serious limits to the force of any argument by analogy. But the ways in which the analogy does not hold emphasize the force of the argument for self-defense and weaken the argument for intervention. In the individual case, the unspoken frame of the example includes the following: an understanding of addiction as an objective impairment of some normal, rational, and physical capacities of self-direction, a perspective which assumes that the intervening actors have accurately characterized the condition of the addict as an addict, and an assumption that the addiction, once resolved, will leave the addict with ordinary capacities of self-governance. But democratic incapacity in a nation, by which I mean the failure of processes to meet democratic standards of weighing interests equally and resolving collective policy, is arguably not like physical addiction. In a state or polity with a prolonged period of imperfectly democratic or authoritarian politics, there is no healthy inner self struggling against political incapacitation, no self to be healed or restored by an intervention. There is only a hope for a future, a hope that such a self can be constituted through the intervention. And we have, to say the least, no reason to think that outside political interventions are capable of building such a self, of creating a democratically self-governing entity. Let me put the point now positively instead of negatively and connect it with a broader philosophical theme. If you agree with me that the Canadian invasion would be wrong, I suspect that the reason is not only a doubt whether American politics can be democratized with a little help from a friend. It's because there is value in Americans making their politics on their own, independently of how well those politics meet the standards of democracy. This is the proper analogy to the individual case, recognizing the value of another nation's autonomy, with little or no regard for how imperfectly that autonomy is realized. Such autonomy is, in a word, to be respected rather than managed, through a policy of forbearance rather than intervention. Intervention is a negation, not a promotion, of autonomy. A commitment to autonomy is fundamental to the liberal tradition, to be sure, but the demand for authenticity and self-command is not only a liberal value, even if it is quintessentially modern. Indeed, it has many non-liberal forms when it is regarded as a collective rather than an individual form of self-realization, as in non-democratic revolutions. The value is that of a made rather than a found existence, the value named by Ralph Waldo Emerson of taking oneself as one's portion. We respect that value domestically through building the institutions of republican and democratic governance. We respect it internationally, not principally by building international versions of these same institutions, but by restraining our actions out of respect for that value in other places. Let me go a step deeper. I think the temptations towards democratic holy wars arises not just from a misprision of the value of autonomy, but from a misunderstanding of the value of democracy itself, or from a mistaken perspective of its value, if you prefer. The trouble comes from a perspective on democracy that focuses too intently on democracy as a set of institutions for distributing political decision-making on the basis of a universal franchise. Such a conception of democracy, while naturally rooted in the self-understanding and perhaps self-misunderstanding of developed Western states, provides too strong a justification for intervention and makes it too hard to miss the considerations on the other side. I call the offending conception a teleic conception of democracy. Democracy as a set of political institutions. It is teleic because the institutional arrangements represent a goal or end state, one that can be designed and implemented from within or without. I want to contrast this institutional conception with what I call an agentic conception. The agentic or active conception of democracy looks to the form of collective agency exercised in a democracy, not to the particular institutional form of its exercise. On the agentic conception of democracy, democratic agency can be honored, perhaps fostered, but it cannot be designed or promoted, or imported. It is a flower that must grow from its own soil. Let me try to be more specific. The teleic conception of democracy at its core reflects an instinct for two principles, one substantive and the other procedural. The substantive principle is a commitment to the moral equality of all persons, to the idea that any right to exercise power over another must be earned in a currency that speaks to the interest of the person being ruled. Democracy shares this commitment with its close cousin, liberalism. The procedural principle insists that the substantive commitment to equality be realized through forms of interaction and mutual justification, that equality be supported by and mirrored in the ways in which basic decisions of the political community are framed. These principles can be given further specification in relation to the kinds of community and decision they're meant to define. A small community whose interests center on common questions of resource use and planning, such as the use of grazing fields, tithes and taxes, how much grain to store against a long winter or bad harvest, etc., will, if it lives democratically, accord all households a voice in common discussion. It may adopt a decision rule of consensus, supermajority or majority, any of which can claim to give equal weighting to individual citizen views, respectively in terms of their objections or preferences. A larger community, by contrast, might try to realize its principles through representative councils, formalized discussions, such as public notice and comment rules, duties of justification and rights of appeal, and perhaps a broader franchise, if broader interests and power are being exercised. In the international arena, the teleic democratic perspective is more a matter of metaphor, an insistence that decisions reflect welfare interests more than balances of power, that decisions affecting the international community be made in public fora rather than through secret channels. It is when we add what is now called the cosmopolitan perspective to the democratic one that we arrive at the potent formula for intervention. The cosmopolitan perspective rejects the normative significance of national boundaries, or at least their significance in the first instance, as opposed to their utility in essentially dividing administrative zones. Descended from Cicero's insistence on our common humanity, cosmopolitanism has known principally two traditions: revolutionary socialism, which saw the underlying class interest of the proletariat as transcending national identities, themselves largely products of capitalist and imperialist projects, and what might be called evangelical liberalism, or the doctrines that the benefits of the liberal democratic state represent not just an equilibrium among competing social groups and forces, but the only form of government true to the instincts of autonomy and rational self-direction. Link the substantive value of universal and equal moral worth to a focus on democratic institutions, and you have the recipe for what has been called muscular liberalism, which is, I think, a term championed by another Canadian, Michael Ignatieff. He may have repudiated the term, but I think he's the one who coined it. The perversity of the position is that while it is grounded in respect for all, it presupposes an essentially clinical and diagnostic perspective on the part of the intervening state, analogous to the perspective of the addict's family. It's the perspective of one who looks across a sea of suffering humanity burdened by non-democratic structures and asks, what can we do to free these selves from their shackles? I realize that my tone here may sound more mocking than I want. They are real values the teleic democrat honors, and the cosmopolitan commitment to universal justice is, in most of its instances, anything but condescending. It valuably insists on treating as morally arbitrary luck or worse the state of affairs in which resources and development opportunities are distributed so unequally across the globe. Nor do I wish to deny the capacities of any political community to live in democratic institutions. Anything to the contrary is bigotry. But the question is, how do we regard those peoples and states living undemocratically for now? What value can we see in their arrangements? More particularly, must we see their democracy deficits as conditions that we might remedy? John Stuart Mill provides a guide to how we might otherwise understand democracy. Democracy, on Mill's view, is the way individuals join with others to pursue common projects, most notably the common project of creating political institutions. In his famous essay defending England's sometimes honored policy of non-intervention, Mill says, quote, "The only test possessing any real value of a people's having become fit for popular institutions is that they, or a sufficient portion of them, to prevail in the contest, are willing to brave labor and danger for their liberation." Mill's point is partly epistemic, of course, that the social capital necessary to sustain democratic institutions has to be in place, already realized by a population, before those institutions can succeed, and that the best test of its existence is whether a people is already engaged in a struggle for democratic liberation. On this account, motivations sufficient to sustain a popular struggle are necessary, if not sufficient, to sustain redistributive institutions as well, since both involve the emergence of a collective me, a view of the self as wrapped up in its collective projects with others. The point is strong, I think, but not extreme. While it would be an exaggeration to say that the established democracies have come about exclusively through mass movements, given the role of incremental change, still revolutionary mobilization has played a role in almost all cases, at least in creating a sometimes latent tradition of democratic practice, later restored. In this way, democracy can be as much a limiting notion for political action as an enabling one, for it calls up the success of the democratic project of forming the general will, not merely in the values that explain why the general will is the appropriate resolution to the problem of diverse but equally valuable individual interests. Democracy, from this perspective, from Mill's perspective, is an achievement, one always on the brink of unraveling, to be sure, and thus one to be defended where it exists. We need not grant the existence of a non-democratic value of sovereignty to see that the mission of democratic states in the world is limited, as a matter of permission and duty, to rectification of a grave set of human wrongs. Instead, from the perspective of active democracy, what matters about democracy is not just the equal weighting of interests, nor the equal weighting of chances to effect common decisions. To be sure, both of these factors are important and explain the centrality of the majoritarian vote within democratic theory as the most perspicuous way of representing the commitment to a principle of equal effect. But those aspects of democracy represent its passive aspect, the way in which it functions as a managerial mechanism for reconciling different interests. They are thus essentially political interpretations of Benthamite utilitarianism and rest on the same principle of negative responsibility as unrestrained consequentialism more generally. Let me add here a comment about Michael Walzer, who's offered in several writings an influential restatement of Mill's argument for non-intervention. According to Walzer, what is valuable in a state, even an authoritarian one, is a culture that is expressed organically through the integration of political institutions with cultural values and practices. Except in what I've called the extreme R2P cases, Walzer argues that respect for the value of culture entails a politics of forbearance, a politics grounded both in legitimate concerns about outsiders' capacity to ascertain the fit between a community's culture and its institutions, and in a herder-like respect for the many varieties of non-liberal cultures. Where there is a political expression of authentic culture, or when we outsiders must operate with such a presumption, then we must honor the culture by declining to intervene. Myself, I think Walzer's prescription is correct, though his diagnosis is mistaken. I do not want to dispute whether cultures as such have intrinsic value. Such a question seems hopelessly crude, given the difficulties in individuating and characterizing anything that might be called a unified culture, in anything but a caricature of national complexity. More to the point, I think that if cultures have some common value, it is because they are expressions of collective activity, of the messy web of micro-bargains, social, economic, and political, through which we as individuals navigate a dangerous world on the rafts we make together. Like the joke about the dog playing the piano, the wonder is that we can do the thing at all, not that we do it especially well. We need not be Hobbesians to regard relatively peaceable collective life as a thing of wonder. The value of self-determination lies in that capacity, and this is what Mill sees and Walzer misses. Once we understand value as residing in agency, in collective agency, we can see why the emergence of democracy is something that structurally must be developed from the inside out, not the outside in. Why the fantasy of importing governance in a box, as the arguments for the American surge in Afghanistan had it, are not only pragmatic, but also normative delusions. The development of a community towards democratic institutions is a project of self-constitution. It is an unending process of transforming the micro-level balances of power and privilege, authority and obedience that characterize social life, into something approximating the teleic ideal. Of course, the pace and ease of that transformation depends on the circumstances in which it occurs, and such transformations and negotiations are always easier in circumstances of relative wealth rather than scarcity. Various forms of international aid can ease the conditions of scarcity and enable the conditions of politics. They can therefore be a permissible and legitimate way of honoring collective agency. But the transformation itself, the constitution of an ever more universal we, is a matter of a process through which individuals realize how to find in themselves a collective voice and perspective, to act through what Rousseau called the moi commun. It is not a process that can be managed from without. I do not mean to sentimentalize the process of democratic self-constitution. Violence, whether of interveners or of a demotic people, will often be part of this process. But the understanding of this violence and its legitimacy is different. On the teleic perspective, violence is justified wherever and whenever it leads to better consequences, measured by democratic metric. If human welfare is what ultimately matters, at least within a secular political theory, then violence will be justified whenever it maximizes welfare. On the agentic theory of democracy, by contrast, violence is justified when it is essential to the formation of a collective democratic agent, a people defining a politics in their own name. Its value is not absolute, not agent neutral, but rather extends only so far as the democratic agency itself and of the forms of well-being that such agency can produce. This is a significant value, and it can justify a broader range of self-defensive rights than a purely moralized theory of war can do, of the sort developed, I think you heard last year, by Jeff McMahon. Moralized theories of war rest on theories of individual interests, as well, in their deontological forms, as individual measures of culpability and liability. By contrast, the agentic view locates value at the level of the active community, as well as at the level of the individuals. The political community formed by that agency has moral standing in its own right, a standing that generates the right of communal and not merely individual self-defense. Such a value is not absolute, even in cases of genuine threat to the community's continued political existence. But as with proto-democratic revolutions, the value of political community can justify a use of force going beyond individual, non-political interests. The truly difficult cases for the agentic view, as I said earlier, will lie in cases at the R2P borderlines. Exercises of violence by authoritarian states that are serious and constitute genuine crimes against humanity, but do not rise to the level of mass genocide. This was arguably the case in Libya, and it is now arguably the case as the world watches the Syrian president shell civilians in Homs. Imagine a group of people in the state engaged in some form of rebellion, seeking a democratic state, in the minimal sense of demanding a leader whose authority stems from mass consent. The demand itself for democracy as standing in the international system represents a value that many nations themselves realize and accordingly respect. But if the rebels have not yet put in place anything that reflects this ideal, that realizes it, the claim is weak. It is weak partly on epistemic grounds, for we are not in a position to know whether social conditions are sufficiently developed to sustain democratic institutions over the authoritarian competitors that will, with great ruthlessness, be pursued in the power vacuum that will ensue. But it is weak also on metaphysical grounds, because the animating value remains hollow until actually practiced, and so it offers little counterbalance against the values that genuinely oppose it, including the values of life, stability, and the benign traditions that even troubled nations and peoples have, traditions that may suffer or disappear in the wake of foreign influence. In the case of Libya, the case for pro-democratic intervention was weak. The aspiration towards democracy surely existed, and the Libyan opposition included expatriates with experience in functioning democracies. But the militia itself showed no democratic character beyond its haphazard organization, nor were there anything like democratic institutions in place from which the rebellion could gather force. I do not wish to make the NATO decision to intervene to seem easier than it was, but it was reasonably evident at the time, and all the more so now, that any intervention that went beyond the R2P mandate would be built mainly on the sands of wishful thinking by Western partners. The problem of wishful thinking by interveners, including most charitably the ease with which intervening nations are prey to local hustlers who know how to talk the talk of democracy, correspondingly represents one of the gravest threats to national interests. Taking this risk seriously in a case like Libya means acknowledging an awkward logical space. Gaddafi's regime had forfeited any claim of self-defense through its own actions, but Western intervention beyond the R2P boundaries was also illegitimate. Perhaps no group in Libya, save Gaddafi and his apparatus, was willing or in a position to object to that intervention, itself a consequence of Gaddafi's destruction of a civic sphere. It still does not follow, I think, that the intervention was right, but only that it faced no one with appropriate standing to object. Now, I'm only a mildly informed observer of the Syrian scene, and I'm hesitant to abuse this platform to offer my amateurish views. But the argument I've sketched here, according to the argument I've sketched here, I think the threshold for armed intervention, or for arming the insurrectionaries in Syria, has not yet been made. Apart from the calculus of practical interests, which counsels caution in any event, respect for the process of democratic transformation means letting the process of internal civil conflict work its way on its own. Now, there is much the international community can do of the naming and shaming variety. And though this is something we might take up in discussion, economic sanctions targeted at the regime seem to me permissible as well, a matter of outside states deciding how to conduct their own relations, what their trade policy should be. But crossing the threshold of war by blockade, no-fly zone, or troops on the ground would represent too direct an attempt to remake a polity from within. That is the hard line I would draw. So to the extent democracy invites outside participation, it does so in a limited way, as a relation between democratic peoples, or rather between peoples already active in democratic politics. I recognize the apparent paradox of this view, that the democracies most worth supporting are the ones least in need of support, a specific form of the general rule that nothing succeeds like success. The arming of an incipient pro-democratic rebellion is correspondingly among the most troubling forms of intervention because it involves the expansion of violent conflict to a people who have not yet, through collective politics, unified themselves in the only way that can legitimate that violence. I've thus far been discussing how the agentic democratic perspective shapes the principled question of whether to intervene. I want to conclude by noting that respecting democracy raises issues not just about whether intervention is permissible with respect to the targeted state, but whether it is permissible for the intervener as well. The democratic state must justify the intervention to its own citizenry and to the institutions of global governance to which it, in principle, is committed. This can raise an acute problem, for genuinely democratic processes are inherently slow while humanitarian emergencies quickly erupt. As with Libya, fluid events and stalemated political systems combine poorly, giving a motivation for highly non-democratic action by executives and setting a precedent for permanent extension of war-making powers. Tension between the needs for action and deliberation might be thought reduced for R2P interventions, since such interventions might be thought to have smaller scope. In practice, of course, even limited humanitarian interventions can give rise to enduring commitments. Thus, even if there has been formal legitimation of the intervention by a state's own democratic politics, the democratic state can find itself subject to fading public interest. The fading of interest or replacement by other popular causes makes it correspondingly hard for democratic commanders to plan operations that extend into the indefinite future. For if popular sentiment changes quickly, the initial investment in the humanitarian effort may well turn out to be wasted lives and treasure. There's a related problem of exit. States launching attacks may be brought in by the best of motives, preventing imminent loss of life to civilians. But the conditions that make, for example, the risk of massacre acute are precisely the circumstances that make it a chronic risk as well, the circumstances of governmental failure. This means that local institutions will almost never be in place after the imminent massacre is averted. Unless and until the institutions of the target state meet a rough standard of democratic legitimacy, the intervention will be deemed incomplete. Modus vivendi is not enough. Thus, democratic states may find themselves whipsawed between popular pressure to cut short interventions and opposing normative pressures, teleic pressures, towards providing better and more robust outcomes for the citizens of the targeted state. The crucial question of what policies or engagements follow upon the initial military adventure, resonates in political morality as much as in political tactics. Battle fatigue may lead a democracy to declare an intervention finished so long as the civil war is not boiling hot, as in Iraq or Afghanistan, albeit wars not considered humanitarian interventions, though fought with democracy exporting ambitions. But it may not consider that an acceptable outcome unless some proto-democratic institutions are also put into place. We're too early in the modern history of intervention to know where these pressures will stabilize. I do not doubt that political choices whether to use violence are driven more by prior outcomes than by philosophical reflection and change. But even if changes of concepts are shaped by, rather than are shapers of, the arc of history, they play an undeniable role in our self-understanding and in the forms of justification we have to offer. I've argued that the teleic conception of democracy has lowered the threshold of justification too sharply, replacing the sovereign presumption of non-interference with a pragmatic calculus of beneficence. Liberating democracy from this conception, and instead making central the value of political agency, may help to move patterns of thought and decision back towards the presumption of non-interference. It's this fundamentally immanent understanding of democracy that I think is our best defense against the threat of democratic holy wars. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. We have some time for questions. Are there any burning questions that you would like to ask at this point?
Or non-burning.
Or non-burning, of course. Yes. And just make sure you take the microphone before you ask your question.
I have many questions, so I'll save some for tomorrow. But one of the things that I was thinking about when you were talking, I agreed with you in many respects, and some of the concerns that you raised are concerns that I've had where people talk about democracy as a way of justifying going to war, and that's worried me. But on the other hand, when we talk about valuing political agency, and we see, maybe we have the society, maybe Rawls' a sense of a decent society, one where we don't reach these extreme R2P cases where you're talking about, but there are still severe concerns about agency and equality.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly wouldn't want to argue that going in and intervening militarily would be the way to go. But does your argument in any way speak against any kind of activity to promote? You talked at one point about aiding. In a way, you're still pushing these kinds of democratic values, even to the point of criticizing. Are we forced to respect and tolerate? Or what can we do to sort of...
Yeah, sorry, that was a part I had, I have in a longer version of this, but not in the talk. So I have there was a line I mentioned, which is the general line I take, which is that transparent and non-coercive aid is possible. I think there's a, so the middle stretch I'm interested in is everything from what Rawls considers decent societies to what he considers burdened societies, but not the societies sort of presently concerned with massacre. I think the forms of intervention that are permissible are basically the forms of ordinary exchange, the forms of trade, exchange, and so forth. And I think also, in foreign aid. So, I do think that creating what I called creating the conditions for politics is a permissible intervention, creating the resources through which a people can constitute itself. What seems to me a more difficult question is direct interventions into politics. I will take it for granted that covert interventions in politics, which certainly has a long history of CIA involvement in the reconstruction of civil democracies in Western Europe, for example, may have positive effects. They may the positive effects may outweigh the negative effects. But I take it for granted that that covert aid to political parties in foreign countries is illegitimate. That's why it's covert. I mean, its exposure would be seen as make it seem as fundamentally illegitimate. Now, what about overt forms of political aid? Could an overt gift be made to a pro-democratic party? That's on the borderline for me of direct attempts to manage a polity. And my instinct is that that would be impermissible. I don't, but it's enough on the borderline of the sort of the line I'm trying to draw between honoring an attempt of a state to stand on its own, to constitute itself, and trying to manage that process that I'm unsure what to say. I don't know if you've got a view about that. I mean, I was thinking, if Canada were to buy political advertising in the United States to support, say, single-payer healthcare, that would seem to me inappropriate. And we have obviously some constitutional law right now on the question of foreign political contributions to elections. But that does seem to me to cross the threshold of interference with kind of autonomous politics.
So it's really more this managing from without that you talked about and interfering, not
naming and shaming,
yeah.
Overt discourse, but targeted political advertising or even overt aid to political parties seems to me to cross the threshold. I'm sorry, what were you about to say?
No, that's good. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a fascinating presentation. My question, I guess I have numerous questions. One that's sociological, and the one that I want to ask right now is historical. I guess in terms of how you conceptualize democracies and the way you've laid out the framework, I do agree in terms of where you've exited. However, I want to know your conceptualization, in terms of how you conceptualize the problem, whether you've taken into account the formation of these nation states. And I guess going back to the work of de Vitoria, Anthony Anghie, who's chronicled de Vitoria's influence on the creation of sovereignty itself in during the Americas, or in the colonization of the Americas, how I guess the understanding of sovereignty itself was forged as a way to control the colonial population, right? And so you fast forward to now, or to the mandate system, and if you take Syria, for example, it's a perfect, it came out of the mandate system where
yes.
the colonial powers drew the lines of what Syria is. So I'm just thinking, I'm wondering, how would you, I guess, situate the responsibility of the creators of this regime, whatever we have right now, in this analysis? Because the way it's set up is that we have nation states, but the nation states did not come out of nowhere. They came out of a colonial enterprise that was meant to subjugate darker nations versus Western nations, right? So in that context, how would you formulate the response?
Right. Well, that's why I'm trying to avoid a way of privileging anything like nation-state boundaries, or privileging. So we can see state boundaries and the governments that happen to control the territories within those boundaries as an artifice. I mean, we have to see them as an artifice and something that represents international calculus of interests. I think there's a different mistake that's made by Walter, where the attempt is to rehabilitate the concept of a people and have that serve the role of the state. Because peoples are also, they're not only artificial constructs, but they don't coincide with state boundaries very well either. So my project is trying to find, and this is a piece of it, trying to find a more fluid conception of what it is that we want to respect. And the idea of an ensemble of people working together in a particularly dense way, the way that I call doing politics, which may mean revolutionary politics, may mean plotting for revolution. But it's a contingent, it's contingent who is in that. They're not necessarily linked by language, by culture, by tradition. But it's whatever group that it is that is engaged in that sort of common work that has the moral standing. That's what I'm claiming. So it's an attempt to agree that looking in the history of sovereignty doctrine, as well as looking at how it has usually operated as a way to mask domestic repression, means that the apparatus of sovereignty itself is something we need to throw away. And I think we can't simply, the argument is we can't simply replace that with the concept of a people understood as a culturally defined entity. We need instead something more fluid. But that fluidity is consistent with its being a reality, that people can organize together at a time and a place and create a common politics.
Thanks. That was very interesting, and I have several questions. I'll try to limit myself to one or maybe two. So, so you gave the analogy of the drug addict and I thought that perhaps in this context a better analogy is someone who's a young boy or young girl, and in that context we're much more willing to acknowledge the not just the permissibility but of the necessity of education, and Mill actually has in On Liberty he makes the distinction between the permissibility of paternalism in the context of children, and so I thought that perhaps in this context, perhaps if you may want to say that the permissibility of kind of kickstarting democracy is because either it will be impossible to generate otherwise, or if not impossible, if you look at the history of now solidly democratic nations, all of them have gone through I don't know if all of them, but many of them have gone through a disastrous period. So if you look at the US, civil war is part of the story of democratization. Yeah. In Germany, Nazi Germany is part of that story. In France, it's the revolution. So the question is, perhaps it's worth helping the child so that he doesn't have to go through adolescence, so that or through an easier adolescence. And in that context, perhaps kind of moving away from the analogy to state that perhaps some kind of aid may help to get us there that will be otherwise impossible. Even if the aim is for the person to, or the state to get there on its own, you need some kind of assistance.
Yeah, I toyed with that as the analogy, and I rejected it for a couple of reasons. One is that it presupposes a kind of natural teleology that I don't think is there for states and people. That children left on their own, they go through their period of savagery, but they eventually become adults, and presumably they become functioning adults. There's no clear teleology to national politics. That's one. The second is, again, the perspective is I wanted an analogy in which it may be that the drug addict analogy is not the good one, or the functioning addict one is not the best one. But I wanted one in which we could acknowledge the kind of the legitimacy of the views of the addict, of saying, it's my problem. It's for me to figure out how I'm going to solve this. And often as my children have not quite hit adolescence, although my son certainly thinks he has. But the attitude of a parent at that point is much more paternalistic. If you allow your children to make their mistakes, but it's because, in your view, that's the best way for them to learn how to live full lives. But that's different from a respect for their right to make their own mistakes. It's the right is purely instrumental. We allow them that space. I mean, no doubt, at a certain period, this changes, and you see the child as having a right. But I think the difficult moment for parenting is with older children, adult children, who are making their own mistakes. And it's not necessarily in their own interest in any long-term sense, but you nonetheless have to stand back. That might be something more like the appropriate analogy. But in general, the literal paternalism of the analogy is what troubles me also as a way of trying to map that onto anything that looks like the right way to think about international affairs, because of course that analogy has held. It is the governing analogy for colonialism, for protectorates, and so that was why I was leery of moving that in that direction. I don't think the growing pains can be avoided. I mean, I think that they can be, as I suggested very briefly in the talk. I think if the international community can try to avoid the problems of resource scarcity, certain kinds of conflicts can be minimized, and that seems to be consistent with the role of outside states. And it does seem to me in general that the worst sort of thing the international community can do is ship extra guns into one party in a conflict. That seems highly unlikely to lead to a better outcome. But beyond that, I don't see any way to sort of help countries past their angry adolescence. Oh, yeah, there's a mic behind you.
Thanks very much. My question is, if you recognize the artifice of national borders and sovereignty, why is your moral argument addressed to states? And would the same moral considerations apply to the oil companies operating in Syria, or to individuals, for instance, Syrian expatriates, the Syrian diaspora, or non-Syrians? So
yes, excellent. Great question. It was addressed to states because I guess I was thinking of it from the perspective of what a state's foreign policy ought to be. I sort of took this up in the tradition which Rawls writes, Law of Peoples, which is what should the foreign policy of a democratic polity be. But I think the question for individuals is basically, is basically the same. There are some different practical issues, but let's separate two groups. One are Syrian expatriates or diasporic Syrians who, or this is certainly true of Libya or Tunisia, who are in fact are exiles. They were democratic activists who wished to return. It seems to me that they are part of that process of self-constitution. That's the self has scattered its pieces, but is reconstituting. People who are committed to Syrian future from the inside have a, perhaps even a duty to return to contribute to the forming of that people, of that active political community. Oil companies. We'll get to oil companies in a second. Take another group of individuals, sort of cosmopolitan do-gooders who want to, channel money towards pro-democracy groups. I think the hard line I want to draw for state intervention applies also to individuals. That that it's a form of benign or benignly meant, but nonetheless wrongful intermeddling. That it's that they can contribute to the overt forms of support, to aid programs, to naming and shaming, and so on. That role of say the NGO community, I think, is extremely important. But to volunteer for duty as a rebel or to provide covert aid, I think crosses the same lines that state support would. The oil companies, I think, should refrain from trying to influence politics in this way. I mean, to say that is to sound hopelessly naive, but I mean, to the extent, multinational oil companies have local interests, and those local interests, it's appropriate for those local business interests, as it's appropriate for any local interest in Syria, to try to have the Syria they want. But for the multinational to try to throw its weight around to foment a revolution or create a state seems to me a clear case of wrongful intervention.
Any further questions? Yes, one more. Can you pass the microphone if possible?
I won't be long, just on what you just mentioned. So you draw the line with the naming and shaming or between violent intervention. Sorry, can you not hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. But I was wondering what your take would be on things sort of like in terms of like rewriting the constitutions for different countries and direct political help from other bodies. So for instance, in Afghanistan, like there were US officials that were helping write the constitution, but when they questioned like local citizens, they had no idea what the questions meant or didn't understand them. Yet now they have a constitution that they say applies to everyone. So things like that, where would you draw the line on?
So I mean, there are two questions. One is, who's brought them in? Are they being brought in as part of the interventionist project? There was a law school classmate of mine who tried to draft an Iraqi constitution, and it was. I mean, if the intervention was wrongful, then helping out in the intervention is wrongful as well. If you're invited in by a state that's there, I mean, they're never pure cases in reality. These are always messy hybrids. But if an outside group is invited in for its constitutional expertise, then I don't see anything wrong with offering those services. But I think there's a real danger in outsiders, sort of, even again well-meant outsiders capturing a process that needs, I think, to emerge from the inside. And I think I don't know what the success rate is of the constitutions in Eastern Europe that were all drafted in the 90s, but I remember various law firms in Washington being hired to go draft constitutions for Kazakhstan and wherever, and I would doubt that. That's a case more of pragmatics than principle. I would doubt that an outside imported constitution is going to be legitimate and function well. Maybe somebody in this room knows more about the case than I do, but these cases.
Okay, so if there are no further questions, I'd ask you to join me in thanking Professor Kutz for a very thought-provoking lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions.